So as humans and omnivores, greens are an essential piece to our diet. Humans have been foraging for leaves and growing different greens forever. And we know they're good for us. They are loaded with vitamins and minerals. They are high in fiber. But the issue is they can be tricky to cook with. Like, how do we get more of them in our diet? And that's what I'm going to be covering today. And I'm talking specifically about those leafy greens, the kale, the Swiss chards, spinach, arugula. They are heavily coming into season right now. You're gonna see them at the markets. Maybe you're growing them at home. And I don't want you to buy them and just have them wilt away in your fridge. So today I'm gonna be showing you every single method and technique and recipe for consuming more greens in your diet. So hopefully you never run out of ideas again. All right, first up is green pasta, and not green pasta sauce, but green pasta. I would say noodles, but I get a lot of shit for calling pasta noodles. The only reason I do that is because pasta can mean this, and pasta can also mean this. We are talking about an actual infusion of greens into the dough here. And what's great about all of these recipes today is you can pretty much sub out any leafy greens you want. So if there's something that's wilting away in your fridge before it spoils, use it for one of these recipes, no matter what it is. For this particular recipe, I had an abundance of spinach and arugula in my garden, so I picked a bunch of that. I would say around a pound. And once that was cleaned, I got that blanching in boiling water for just 1 minute, just until it's wilted, but it still retains all of that beautiful color. And then those greens go directly in cold water to stop the cooking and retain that brightness. Then into a blender, I cracked 5 eggs and then squeezed the living hell out of the greens to remove as much of the liquid as possible, which then goes into the blender to blitz up to create a nice, smooth, uniform green liquid. And for the dough, I have both all-purpose flour and some fine semolina flour, and I added them into a mound, first on a tray in order to not stain my wood surface. And I was so excited to make this dough that I completely forgot about adding salt to the dough, which I will say the final product, it really didn't matter. The noodles were so thin, you can just salt the water, you can salt the sauce, it was fine. But for all of you, I would add a little bit of salt to your dough. And I made a little mound, started to pour in all of that green liquid and just slowly start working that into one cohesive dough. And I'm not doing exact measurements here, but when you're making a pasta dough, it should be much firmer than, say, a pizza dough. So I'm just adding flour on top and working it into the dough to create a nice firmness that I'm happy with. And once I was happy with the firmness, I transferred it over to the board and started working that into a dough that felt nice and smooth. Then I wrapped the dough in plastic and let it sit in the fridge to rest for about 1 hour. And I sliced the dough into 4 workable pieces and started sending that through the pasta roller one setting at a time. Now, once all of my pasta was rolled out into thin sheets, my favorite hack for making pasta that will change your life, I made a whole short video about this, is let those pasta sheets just sit on your kitchen surface, whatever it is, for about an hour. And what's gonna happen is they're gonna dry out, and instead of being sticky together, they're gonna be more tacky. So you don't have to add a ton of extra flour or semolina to get them from not sticking. You can just start sending them through your cutter and they will not stick together. It is an incredible feat, but it works like a frickin' charm to make the most perfect pasta. Now, I will tell you with all honesty that these were the best noodles or pasta that I have ever made in my life or ever tasted in my life. Even the first time, they cooked in like 1 minute. I put some olive oil in there, a little bit of salt. Just the pasta on its own with no sauce was so good. And what shocked me the most was how light the vegetables made the pasta. It felt like you were tasting pasta that was 50% lighter than, say, just a gluten-based pasta. It was incredible, something I didn't expect. A little bit more labor intensive, but I would highly suggest trying this one if you have the time and of course you have the equipment. So for this next one, I wanted to create a recipe where you could go into the fridge and pull out any type of greens and just infuse them into a delicious patty. So I'm calling this a garden burger. You can call it a veggie burger, but I didn't want to make one of those bullshit veggie burgers where you bite into it and it just mushes. We've all had one of those veggie burgers, and it's what turns us off of veggie burgers. That is not what this is. This thing is hearty and it is delicious. For this recipe, I am using what I will call the Fab Four of leafy greens. We've got Swiss chard, arugula, kale, and spinach. But if you have just kale, if you have just spinach, you can use that. It's totally fine. And I knew that just greens would not be enough to hold up for this burger, so what I did was I cooked some lentils until they were nice and soft, and I cooked some chickpeas until they were nice and soft, which can also be subbed out for any beans or legumes that you have on hand. But the key is to drain out any extra liquid so you're not adding that into our final mixture. And then the next step is to blanch all of our greens in boiling water, which takes around 1 to 2 minutes, and those go directly into the ice bath to shop. And just like the pasta, we want to get as much liquid out of these greens as possible so we have a nice crispy patty. So the next step is I'm going to take out all those greens and I'm going to chop them up by hand, which is a little bit more tedious. You can do this all in a food processor, but I'm telling you, the final product is just not the same. The texture is so nice when they're hand chopped. And I'll add all of those greens into a bowl. I'll add in some of those cooked chickpeas and lentils. Then to bring it together, I'm adding 2 eggs, some flour, and I'll season this mixture with salt and pepper. All right, so to cook up these patties, I am bringing out my griddle, which brings me to the sponsor of today's video, which is Made In, the maker of this beautiful carbon steel griddle pan. Now, this beast is made in Sweden with the same professional grade carbon steel that the best chefs in the world are using. And personally, I love carbon steel. I think it is one of the most versatile cooking surfaces because it retains heat so well, but it's lighter than cast iron, and it's naturally non-stick when seasoned. And what's great about these made-in griddles is they come pre-seasoned, so they're ready right out of the box without any seasoning needed on this griddle. And speaking of versatility, a great design feature of this griddle is that it can be used outside as well to cook under fire or coals, which is nice if you want to bring this camping with you or just do some rustic outdoor cooking. You've got that option. Also, if you're a burger fan, I would highly suggest the combo of this griddle with the made-in stainless steel grill press for just life-changing smash burgers. These things were so good. And I've been a Made In fan for many years. They have an extensive product line that I think is designed so well for home cooks. And they partner with family-owned manufacturers in the US, France, UK, and Italy to produce some extremely high-quality kitchenware at a really great price. And you can check out the carbon steel griddle and Made In's other cookware by using the link in my description to save on your order. Now back to these burgers. So I got them nice and crispy on both sides, and in this case, since we were lacking the fat of, say, ground beef, I thought a fried egg could really bring some balance. Then to bring these burgers together, I toasted up some of that homemade brioche. Then to the bottom, I added my homemade mayo, threw on that patty and fried egg, and then finally some pickled red onion, and let me tell you, this was not your average shitty veggie burger. All right, so this next one is a fun one. It's very simple. It's a play on a Furikake, which is a Japanese seasoning that's made up of mostly dried seaweed. Now you sprinkle this stuff on your rice or fried egg. It gives it a nice umami, salty kick. And I thought it'd be fun to switch out the seaweed with something readily available, which are leafy greens. And I thought the best substitute would be kale and Swiss chard, which I both had growing in my greenhouse. Both of these greens are super hearty, but when they are cooked or roasted or even dehydrated, you can really bring out a lot of umami in these greens. Think about a kale chip and how much umami and saltiness those things have. So I cleaned off my kale and my chard, and I gave them a spray with some coconut oil just to give them a little bit of extra flavor. Now I'm dehydrating these greens in my dehydrator, but you can accomplish a very similar thing in your oven on the lowest temperature it goes. So I got out my dehydrating trays, I added all my greens, and I sprinkled them with a little bit of salt, and I threw them in the dehydrator at 125 degrees Fahrenheit for 24 hours until they were nice and dried and crispy. Then I crunched up my greens, stuffed them in my little $20 spice blender, and I pulsed them up, but not too fine. We're not making a powder. I wanted to leave some bigger pieces of leaves so you really know what's going on here. Then I dumped those leaves into a bowl, added some nutritional yeast on top just to boost the umami flavors a bit. I added in some gochujang chili flakes for some spice, spice, which is what I had on hand, but you can use any chili flakes or omit the spice completely. To season it up, I added a little bit of sugar, some salt, of course, and finally a bunch of toasted sesame seeds. All right, up next is something that is probably pretty obvious for most of you, but I feel like it needs to be mentioned in a video about greens, which is making fresh juice. Now, I've been making fresh juice for years, ever since I saw that documentary, what was it? Fat, Sick, and Nearly Dead. That was actually a big revolution for me on my journey to understanding healthier eating habits like 10 years ago. Now, of course, that movie is very extreme and it got me into juicing heavily at the time. And I will say, over the years, I've learned that in a lot of cases, the juice is just not worth the squeeze. And what I mean by that is juice takes a lot of ingredients to make, and you're throwing out a lot of ingredients, or at least composting it or turning it into something else. So what I find is that I'm juicing when juice ingredients like greens are in season. When they're abundant and cheap at the markets or you're growing them at home, that's when I hit the juice heavy. For this juice, I'm using Swiss chard, kale, and spinach, 3 of my favorite ingredients for juice. And my best tip for making a nice, healthy green juice is to add citrus. The acidic quality of citrus will cut through the intensity of the greens while adding sweetness. So I like a balance of, say, an orange for the sweetness plus just the lemon to really cut through. You can also, of course, add other aromatics like ginger or turmeric. You can add other vegetables or fruits, but just a nice citrus green juice for me really hits the spot and is a great way to use up greens. Now, obviously, when you're juicing these ingredients, you're removing the fiber, so it's not something that you want to be consuming all of the time, but the way I kind of treat juice is like a multivitamin. You're getting almost a direct infusion into your bloodstream of all of these nutrients and vitamins without actually having to digest much food. So I look at it as a little immunity boost that I'm trying to also make taste good and enjoy the experience. Now, speaking of fiber, I think a much more sustainable and in most cases cheaper way to get raw greens just directly into your diet is making smoothies, specifically green smoothies, which you have seen me make on this channel for countless years because it's something that I actually do in my normal life. Like I said, juicing is more of a treat when things are in season, but I'm making green smoothies on the regular to the point where my kids have started to enjoy helping out with the process. It's a fun thing that they can get involved in, and I find when kids are actually making something and they're involved in the process, they're more likely to actually want to consume it. So next up is my favorite use for an abundance of leafy greens. Probably the most popular leafy green based dish in the world, I would say, which is saag. Found all over the Indian subcontinent in different flavors and varieties, but the key is a base of greens. So I went out to my garden and I did some picking. I got some spinach, some kale, a bunch of Swiss chard, some arugula. And then when I was walking back, I actually found a patch of mustard greens. These are wild mustard greens. So I picked some of those to throw in the mix. And the prep for this dish is fairly simple. I'm slicing up half an onion, and you can make a ginger garlic paste, but I'm chopping both of those aromatics up fine, and I'll just blend them up later. And this dish being Indian inspired, there's endless spice directions you can take. I'm using these whole spices right here, and I'm gonna add them all to a mortar and pestle, and I'll give them a super rough grind. Now to a large pot, I'm gonna add a few tablespoons of ghee, and I had some extra chicken fat that I wanted to use up, so I added that to the mix, and I threw in those spices to temper and infuse in that oil for a few minutes until they were nice and fragrant. Then in goes the onion, which I'll cook for a few more minutes, followed by the ginger and garlic. I'll cook all those aromatics down until they really start to soften and caramelize, which is when I start dumping in my greens, one batch at a time. And I'll just add them to the pot, cover them, and once they wilt down and cook a little bit, then I'll add another batch until all the greens are fully wilted down. And this is totally optional, but I'm adding some veggie stock that I had in the fridge from my last composting video, and I'll cook that for a few minutes. Finally, I'll transfer everything over to a blender to give it a few pulses, and how smooth or chunky you want your saag is really up to you. Now, what I personally like to do is I keep these just base saag, we'll call it. I can freeze a few of these depending on how much I make, and then I take it out of the fridge or the freezer, and then I can customize it how I want. So I could add some coconut milk and some chickpeas and some paneer and really anything you want to really keep things interesting throughout the week. All right, and finally, for this last recipe, I thought it'd be fun to do a little outdoor cooking. So I took a little journey outside. I picked some fresh green garlic, which is just underdeveloped garlic, some spring onion, and I took a little visit to the chicken coop to grab a few eggs. Now the first thing I'm doing is prepping the green garlic and onion by just chopping off the root and slicing that up nice and thin. I'm gonna get 2 pans on the burner. In the first saute pan, I'm gonna add some oil in and start cooking that garlic and onion. I'll add some oil to the other saute pan because I'm cooking up some flatbreads because we are making green shakshuka. Now for my greens, I picked a bunch of spinach. I also have some Swiss chard and arugula that I chopped up, and I added all of that on top of the onion and garlic to start wilting that down and frying it up. And look at this flatbread ready to go. I'll get that off, throw on another one, and now that everything's wilted, I'll just fry those greens up a little bit longer, lift that flatbread, season up those greens with some salt and pepper, flatbread 2 ready to go, and I'm gonna make a few divots in these greens, crack in my eggs, season up those eggs, then I'll throw a lid back on that pan and just let those eggs cook through. And once those eggs were cooked through, I took it off, topped it with some fresh herbs, and enjoyed. So hopefully you enjoyed all of these ideas for using up your greens. If you want some more cooking inspiration, click the video right here, and I'll see you next time.